Hi, everyone. I am your host, Kenzie Chase.
And I'm Jenny Gable.
And today we have a recap to do for you today. We have the Au Pair Affair murder trial recap. And we are joined with us with our Randy Bass, who was actually at the court covering all of this firsthand and getting sort of the behind the scenes information. So we have our Randy Bass here. Randy Bass, can you tell us a little bit what about your first impressions were with this case?
Oh, yeah. I mean, going into this case, we knew that this trial was going to last potentially 4 weeks. That was what they had it scheduled for. The trial, though, only ended up taking about 3 weeks. But that's still quite a long time. That's a lot of hours for those jurors to really be locked in this case. And we knew right from the get-go that this case was going to be a wild ride from beginning to end. We knew some of the details going into this, but some of those things we learned throughout the trial, some of those major moments, those are going to stick with me and from other reporters and crews who were out there covering it and just following this trial from beginning to end.
Right. And I know that with the snowstorm that kind of hit the DMV area, there was kind of some concerns about how that might affect the jury's verdict that they reached as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, we all lived through that snowstorm that buried our region. We still have ice and snowcrete on the ground. And so the judge and the defense and the prosecutors in this case really kind of planned for that. They added extra days to the court schedule leading up to this snowstorm to try and get ahead of things so that way this trial wouldn't be extended any longer past that initial 4-week mark that they had expected for it to go. And so I also talked with some of our legal experts and everything, and they felt like having that break in the middle of the trial allowed some of that testimony, especially that early testimony from the au pair in this case, to really sink in with those jurors while they were at home for 4 days before they came back and heard that testimony from Brendan Banfield. I mean, we're here recapping the case, but just kind of recapping for those of you who are catching up with us here now. Brendan Banfield was accused, now convicted, in the murder of his wife, Christine Banfield, and a man named Joseph Ryan, a stranger who was lured to their home using a fake profile, posing as Christine on a fetish website online, bringing him to that home, trying to frame him for the murders. And that's the story that Brendan Banfield told while he was on the witness stand. But we heard a very different story from the au pair, Juliana Perez Magales, and we are going to break down some of that testimony, some of those major and wow moments for you right here during this recap after the verdict today.
Yeah, and I think it's just something that's, I don't know, when I first heard about this trial was just how crazy and kind of just twisted this entire thing was. I have never heard, like, I know we've talked about a lot of cases.
We have our show DMV Confidential where we break down a lot of these true crime cases in the DMV area, and I have yet to hear something as bizarre as this. And like you mentioned, we already know the verdict. We know that he was found guilty on all charges, and we're actually going to play a brief clip where the judge kind of lets him know what happened. So we're going to play that real quick.
In criminal case number FE 2024-666, count 1, we, the jury on the issue, join in the case of the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Brendan Robert Banfield, defendant, find the defendant guilty of aggravated murder of Joseph Ryan and Christine Banfield as part of the same act or transaction.
Yeah, just kind of walking through what was going on in the courtroom at that time.
Yeah, tell us, like, what was the reaction? What was his stature
all
like?
of us reporters who had been there, many of us were there every single day, like I was, from beginning to end, listening to that testimony, seeing that evidence, sometimes graphic evidence, and hundreds of exhibits that were shown to the court. And so, I mean, I'm sitting in there, and it's kind of like you're just that crazy level of anticipation. And mind you, that verdict came down on Monday right around 5 p.m. So we had all been sitting there since court started that morning, right around 10 a.m. So 7 hours later, we're all thinking we're going home for the day for another day of deliberations tomorrow. Then we find out we're all sitting right outside the courtroom door waiting for that verdict. We hear something's going on. Everybody kind of rushes through those doors back into the gallery. We're sitting there, and this verdict process, I mean, really only took 5 minutes. Once they brought the jury back in, everybody's sitting down. We're all kind of just waiting with bated breath. I felt that, that anxiety, those butterflies, and your stomach, just been really invested in this trial, sat there for 3 weeks listening to it right alongside those jurors. And for me, we were all just kind of watching and waiting and looking around. They bring the jury back in. They read that verdict. No real outbursts in court, but a lot of emotion from Christine Banfield's family. The Bensons were there sitting, hugging, embracing, crying as those verdicts were read. I sat right behind Brendan Banfield's parents, and you could just feel the tension in that room. But what we noticed and what you saw there on the video we just played was that Brendan Banfield was mostly emotionless. He was just kind of somber.
That was the first thing that I noticed when I watched it, is that he kept a very almost
poker face.
It looked like his eyes
face.
Maybe like opened a little bit when it was said, but he was just very stoic.
Now, Randy, were you surprised by this verdict? I was surprised by how quickly the verdict came in. But were you surprised by the verdict itself?
Yeah, I mean, these jurors really only had between 8 or 9 hours. They went to lunch on Friday, started deliberations, and then came back Monday for that full day. I thought that this was going to go into a second day, maybe even a third day. To think of all of the days of testimony and evidence and exhibits that they heard, just dozens of hours, to boil that down to a verdict for 2 very serious charges, aggravated murder, plus those 2 additional charges, the firearm charge and the child endangerment charge, because their little girl was in the basement as all of this was going on. So that just adds another layer to this story. So the way I felt going into this verdict was it might be all or nothing. They're either, if you convict him on 2 aggravated murder charges, you got to convict him on the firearm charge, and you got to convict him on the child endangerment charge. But if you don't convict him on those other charges, then it really is, you get a slate of all guilty verdicts, or you get a slate of all not guilty verdicts. And I had conversations leading up to this verdict, which was, had the prosecutors met their burden, and had the defense really planted any reasonable doubt, putting Brendan Banfield on the stand, was that a right move?
Right.
Was that a risky
That's not something
move?
you see very often. You don't see
very typically like a strategic thing.
Because we obviously, we know that he has the right to not testify in his case. So I thought that was shocking in of itself, that he went up and he testified, and I think the prosecutors were able to poke some holes in his testimony. And we're actually going to play a clip briefly of some of his testimony.
Was attacking Christine. I wish I shot him earlier. Christine told me that she was bleeding out, and that she was sorry, and that she loved me.
Could hear some of that right there, and as he was recalling bits of what has now been shown to be a fabricated story after his conviction, he sits there on the stand, and that was really the only time we saw Brendan Banfield show any emotion at all while he was on the stand. And something prosecutors described afterwards, I want to get some of the words right that she said. Jenna Sands, the prosecutor who had the chance to cross-examine Brendan Banfield, kind of said he was, cold and didn't really speak of his wife in a loving way on the stand.
Right, but even though he says,
we're together for
he tried to downplay his affair. He said this was just like a casual thing, not as important of his wife of 19 years. And, he mentions the longevity of their relationship, and yet not very much emotion at all.
Something I noticed is that when he's talking about his relationship between his wife Christine and the daughter, he talks about it as like a loving relationship. But I know that that also came up in the testimony in regards to kind of maybe his motivation for,
right. Well, and they even talk about the fact that the prosecutor asks him, why did it take so long for your relationship to really pick back up with the au pair? And he straight up says, because Christine was still around. So that just further, backs up their motive that this was driven by the affair.
And while he was on the stand, the prosecutor really got in a couple of jabs at him. Jenna Sands really went at him. And at one point, something that I will not forget from this trial is Jenna Sands is up there cross-examining Brendan Banfield on the stand. And she says, Brendan, when you set this whole thing up, and he says, I didn't set this whole thing up. And then she says, sorry, when Christine set this whole thing up. So she really kind of got into this sarcastic tone, really kind of poking holes, getting a few jabs in at him on the stand. And
I remember that. That was
a very noticeable part.
Yeah. Well, because she even paints the picture of, okay, when you're talking about this stranger rape fantasy that Christine reportedly, came up with, she's like, okay, well, so you guys discounted all these people that wanted to meet in person, that wanted to see more photos, that wanted to hear a phone call. Now, this is obviously a very risky situation. If you are the person actually trying to enact this fantasy, why wouldn't you want to make sure that you're safe and you're secure with the person that you're going to be doing this thing with?
Absolutely. And Juliana Perez-Magales, the au pair in this case, when she took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, we heard from her and she described walking them through the process, walking prosecutors and defense attorneys and the court through the process of how they boiled this down to pick that man, to pick Joseph Ryan, who ultimately loses his life, becomes a victim in this case.
And a scapegoat.
Yes. And looking to frame him for this horrible, horrible crime. So, I mean, they walked through the process and they said exactly kind of like as you were describing, Kenzie, which is that they were looking for someone specifically who was willing to not meet in person. And even in their earlier conversations with Joseph Ryan, which were shown to the court and shown to the jury, you see Joseph Ryan, he is asking those questions. He wants to meet in person. But whoever is on the other side of that screen, which we now know were Brendan and Juliana posing as Christine, telling Joseph Ryan that that's part of the thrill of it, that they didn't want to know, or that Christine didn't want to know who was coming to the house, and all of this. And they did actually end up, at Joseph Ryan's request, having a phone call the night before. And Juliana gets on the phone and talks with him. And Joseph Ryan says something about how he was surprised that she had an accent and noted that in his conversation with her. And he was like, oh, I was surprised. I didn't think that you would have an accent. So there were conversations had leading up to this, and that FetLife account, the account was created, I believe it was January 9th, and then these murders were carried out on February 24th of 2023. So in that 6 to 7 week period, they are hunting for somebody to bring into the home to frame for this crime. So this really happens fast, and it happens with a lot of care and deliberate planning on their behalf. They used Christine's devices to try and make this untraceable back to themselves. So, I mean, there was a certain level of planning with this.
And I think it just really goes to show how calculated, which I know, again, with the aggravated murder charge here, that this was a very long thought out. It wasn't, this is something, and I know that they had mentioned the au pair's testimony that I believe it was maybe around October 2022. He mentioned that he wanted to kind of find a way to get rid of his wife.
Get rid of his wife. That's the exact phrase.
And let's actually hear from Juliana herself real quick.
Brendan do next?
When I was bringing him the towel, he got on top of her, and that's when I first saw him stab her with a knife. We all deserved to know what really happened. I just couldn't keep it to myself. The feeling of shame and guilt and sadness, and I had a potential of getting less time.
Yeah, we just heard from Juliana Perez-Magales. She is the au pair at the center of this case. And you just heard her describe the moment she saw Brendan Banfield jump on top of his wife, start stabbing him. What you didn't hear, though, was what she said happened afterwards. Juliana said that she went and hid behind the other side of the bed, covered her eyes and ears as this was all happening, because she said she just couldn't stand to watch what was going on. And then we heard her describe why she ultimately told this story to prosecutors, because she was sitting behind bars from September or October of 2023 till October of the next year in 2024. After Brendan Banfield is arrested, that's when she finally flips. That's when she tells this story to prosecutors after maintaining her innocence and Brendan's innocence, sending jailhouse letters back and forth for those 12 months, saying that she was going to stand by Brendan and that she was never going to say anything. And she said that, that they were trying to get her to lie and this and that, but she ultimately tells that story, and the defense really leaned into that in their cross-examination of her on the stand.
And Randy, I want to talk about those letters, because that's part of the defense's main point when they're trying to prove that she's not reliable. She's not a reliable witness, because the letters show that in this time she was in jail, she had sort of a declining mental health issues. She talks about feeling like she doesn't want to go on. And that was really a main point when the defense was trying to poke holes in her story, that, she was doing this to get a lesser sentence. Her mental health wasn't great. She was going to get money at the end of this because from selling her story.
And that they really just, she had mentioned that they really defense mentioned that they wanted to kind of put this on her almost, to have her testify to really get him in the end and get him arrested.
Like the prosecutors wanted her to testify in order to get Banfield.
Oh yeah, police and prosecutors admitted that was exactly that was their plan. That Juliana was arrested first to try and get her to flip against Brendan Banfield. That was a plotted move by police and prosecutors in this case. And as you saw Juliana there, she was also mostly cold on the stand. A little bit of emotion there, but not a ton. And Juliana also had the opportunity, and prosecutors had the opportunity to put her up there within the first, day and a half.
Right, she came on super early on in the trial.
And so everything else after that, they were able to use that to corroborate Juliana's story. They had a few police witnesses, a few witnesses like the medical examiner who came up there first testifying for the prosecution, and then it was the Juliana Perez-Magales show, the au pair show. She was up on the stand much longer than Brendan Banfield ended up on the stand. She was up on the stand for, I want to say, a full day and then part of the next day. So, I mean, she was really up there for a long time, and police, or rather prosecutors, were building that case, defense trying to poke holes in that story, and then really everything else after that, you had to weigh that against Juliana's testimony. And so Juliana's testimony, they said that they felt like they could have gotten a conviction without it. But I'm not sure of that, because it's like there were a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and then Juliana's testimony put all of those pieces together.
Right, and I was going to ask you
into a narrative that the jury could follow.
I was going to ask you about that, Randy, because this was a case that relied predominantly on circumstantial evidence.
Oh, yes.
So you don't believe that they would have been able to get this conviction without Juliana's testimony, is that correct?
I think that there's a chance that they could have, but I think that Juliana was a compelling witness regardless of, the plea deal that she had accepted before this, which she could end up receiving time served. She's set to be sentenced on February 13th, so that is still yet to be seen. But she had, and we heard her say it just a few moments ago, we played that soundbite from her, where she says that she had the opportunity to get less time. She admitted that that was a big part of her decision to get on the stand and testify against her former lover, Brendan Banfield, was that she did have the opportunity to potentially get less time. She wants to go back home to Brazil to see her family. She wants to potentially make money off of this case. So, I mean, we heard a lot from her up there on the stand. And I think that by her weaving all of these pieces together into a narrative that the jury could understand and have all of these little pieces of evidence to corroborate everything that she said, from blood evidence to what happened in the house to what happened in the months leading up to and the months after. I think that was big too. They talked a lot about what happened after. They showed pictures of Juliana's closet on the day of the murder, and then showed pictures of Juliana's closet a few months later in October when they went back to arrest her. Juliana's closet was empty in the October following those murders. Why? Because all of her stuff had been moved into the master bedroom closet next to Brendan's stuff, and they had already moved Christine's items out of that room. They had gotten new bedroom flooring. They'd gotten new bedroom furniture. They had gotten, new photos and everything on the walls. We've shown those throughout the trial. There were photos on the nightstand of Brendan and Juliana, were photos of Brendan and Christine once sat. And so for her to have moved into Brendan's late wife's bedroom, who he was supposedly grieving at the time, and that was the story that he was telling, I mean, I really do think that was really telling. And so to have her testimony, I think that was big, but for her to be able to weave together some of that scientific evidence that we felt like wasn't super strong in this case, Brendan's DNA not found on the knife, for instance, I think that was big in terms of trying to convict him.
And I want to talk about... Go ahead, Jenny.
I know with the photo that you mentioned, that's something that I remember specifically sticking out to me as just somebody who was hearing about this case and kind of, I can imagine the jurors as well kind of hearing about that, how she had moved bedrooms and things after something like this had taken place. It's supposed to be kind of a grieving husband, and then all of a sudden there's the image of, the au pair and him on the nightstand, and her items are in his room, and, they're just kind of living together like as a couple again after something tragic like this had taken place. I think, as someone just hearing it, I could imagine like how that influenced me, how that could have influenced the jurors. But like as you said, Randy, like with the big focus on the blood evidence and the digital forensics, I know that prosecutors were saying that it revolved around the blood evidence, but a lot of people felt like not really so, because the defense kind of tried to poke holes in that evidence there with the as well as with the digital forensics, and how they couldn't really decipher who was on the other end of those chats there.
Right, and when we talk about the evidence that we're talking about, the blood evidence and stuff, we're actually going to show you some pictures from some of the evidence that was collected. Now, we're going to give you a disclosure. Some of this evidence is going to be a little graphic, so viewer discretion is advised, because we're going to be showing photos from the scene, which is obviously not going to be super pretty. So just viewer discretion advised as we go into this next part. But here we go. So here is some of the evidence that we get to see come in. We see this blood knife that is a pretty big knife, Randy. That's a pretty hefty duty.
It's a large knife, and so that's the photo that was uploaded to the exhibits after all of this was said and done. But we saw that knife. That physical knife was pulled out in court, shown to the jury in a bag, placed on the overhead projector for all to see. And when I saw them carrying it back and forth, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that is a massive knife. And mind you, this knife, Juliana and Brendan posing as Christine on that FetLife account, luring him to the home, they told Joseph Ryan to bring that knife to the home so that way he would have something and that he would be bringing the murder weapon to that scene there.
Because they could have used any old knife from their own kitchen, but instead,
I think it really goes back to painting him as the scapegoat. And I guess mentioning that they pulled out that knife in court, and they're showing the jurors kind of these images as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe the faces of people in the courtrooms, maybe some reactions there that you saw being there in person at the time? Because I can imagine seeing these things very, disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, in some of these images, we're showing you the more kind of PG-13 images here, but some of the more rated R images, some of them that were really especially graphic, those were sealed, and we, sitting in the gallery, did not get to see them. So the worst of the worst images, those were all shown to the jury and shown to counsel, shown to the judge, but there were some things that we didn't see. So we were all kind of sitting there almost having to come up with this image in our mind of what they were describing as they were sitting on the stand testifying to some of those images that were shown in court. But there were also large screens where the gallery could see some of what was being shown to the jury, and we were all really locked in. There were a lot of us in the gallery each day looking up, really just kind of locked in on what we were looking at and trying to decipher exactly especially when it came to that digital evidence that was really kind of convoluted and tough to break down. But in terms of the digital evidence, what we heard was from both experts that were brought into the case for both the defense and the prosecution was that you can only tell what a device is doing and who that device belongs to. You can't necessarily tell who is doing it unless the webcam's on, unless there's physical evidence that you were the one on that laptop sending those messages. We can only ideate and deduce who might be behind that laptop or behind that cell phone sending those messages. So they tried to cross-reference some of that with geolocation showing where Brendan's phone was and Juliana's phone was. Were those phones at home at the time that those messages were being sent from the Christine FetLife account? So breaking that down in painstaking detail was really difficult for jurors to follow, and for us in the gallery to follow. It's a lot of really convoluted, complex data, lines and lines and lines of Excel sheets that they're showing us trying to break it down. And so I think that they may have lost the jury at some point during that testimony. It became really long and mundane, especially after hearing really compelling testimony from both Juliana and Brendan to go from that, where everybody's locked in and really engaged, to go from that to this 7-hour-long testimony from a digital forensics expert. Now, that's just not going to have
Randy,
the same weight.
Do we know if they ever tested the computer? Because I remember Brendan said he never really touches Christine's computer because that's hers. She has her own device. He has his own device. Did they ever test any of that for DNA evidence? Do we know?
So I'm not sure that they tested it for DNA evidence. That was not something that came up in the trial. And DNA evidence for me was not necessarily central to this case because they've still convicted Brendan Banfield even though his DNA was not found on that knife. They tested it. They only found DNA from Christine and from Joseph Ryan. They never found any DNA from Brendan Banfield on anybody else at that crime scene except for his wife and I believe on Christine perhaps, and then on Joseph Ryan, they did not find his DNA at all, even though they said, the prosecutor said that he staged the scene to make it look like Joseph Ryan was bloodier than he already was after he was shot twice, once by Brendan, once by Juliana. So I think that was interesting. And so for me, that DNA evidence or lack thereof really wasn't central to the case. And a lot of us, we're true crime fans, we're Law and Order fans, and we're expecting that smoking gun or expecting that DNA evidence to be there to absolutely convict somebody. It's 2026. We're expecting that DNA evidence to be there, to be part of bringing this case to a conviction and a certain conviction on all counts. I think that was, for me, something that could have potentially planted reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, and that was something that Brendan Banfield's defense really honed in on during their case and in trying to build their case and build reasonable doubt.
Some final talking points. Sorry, Jenny, not to cut you off, but
fine.
Some final talking points of just the breaking point. For me, the breaking point was when Brendan Banfield was saying all the stuff that his wife had said. He was saying like, I love you, I'm bleeding out, he has a knife. And the prosecutor kind of dives into this, that, you know, at that point when she's saying all this stuff, she would have already had to have all of the stab wounds. And so how is she talking with all of these stab wounds in her neck?
Well, he also couldn't account for all of the stab wounds.
Right.
What I remember,
he only saw 2.
You know, she was stabbed, I believe, 6 times.
6 or 7.
And he mentioned 2 different stab wounds, I believe. So that is also something that stuck out to me. You know, if she had been, his accounts just did not line up. And I guess kind of going on to the au pair's testimony and a little bit more about her role in this. I know you mentioned that, Randy, that she had got this almost what some were calling a sweetheart deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about that and kind of the reactions to that. I know her sentencing is set for next Friday, but she could get time served. She could get the maximum of, I believe, up to 10 years.
Yes.
So there's a lot of discourse over her role in this and the amount of time she might be getting.
100%. Something I've heard from our own colleagues in this building and from friends and family and everybody that I've talked to about this case is, how did Juliana end up walking away with this crazy deal? I mean, she's been in jail since October of 2023, so about 2.5 years at this point. But for her to potentially walk away from this with time served after this is all said and done, with the potential for her to be sent back to Brazil, where she could really potentially live out the rest of her days there without any kind of recourse or anything, and where she could potentially profit from all of this, make money. Netflix and other documentary companies had allegedly offered her money. We heard that come out in the trial, and as part of what may have influenced her to testify and come forward and finally change her story. But the judge in this case, Penny Azcarate, she does not have to go along with this sentencing deal. She does not have to agree to time served. They did reduce Juliana's charge, though, to manslaughter, so the judge can sentence her up to 10 years, and she's already been behind bars for about 2.5 years. So that is all still yet to be seen. And Brendan Banfield, his sentencing is set for May 8th of 2026. His sentencing, more set in stone. Those aggravated murder convictions come with that mandatory penalty of life in prison.
Yeah, so thank you, Randy, so much for being on this. We are also going to be doing a full dive into this case for DMV Confidential. We're going to do an extended version because there is so much information for us to have to dive into. But thank you, Randy, for your time, and we will see you guys for our episode DMV Confidential.